All right, so we're starting off with a simple outline, lightly with pencil. Remember, you don't want to go too dark because you will see your pencil marks through the paint and that's going to look cheesy. So you want to make sure that those pencil marks are very light because you're going to be painting over them. So I always start a landscape with the sky first, and I work my way from the background to the middle ground and then to the foreground. For how the sky is typically the lightest plane of the landscape. So we're going to make sure our sky is really light. We're not going to go too intense with that sky and definitely not too dark in value. So go probably a little bit paler than you think you need to, because that does need to read as very light. It'll help that whole idea of pushing it back into the distance. And that's really the goal of the atmospheric perspective, is we're going to create a sensation of like depth or distance. So like with any painting that we do, this is going to be a layered piece. So what you see right now, it's going to be adjusted. It's going to have more layers on it. I really think that the more layers you put on there, as long as they're not too thick at first, so you start off thin, then it'll make your painting look more rich, and it'll also make it look more professional. Be careful that you do not dab. You're not getting in there and then getting out really fast. You want to put down a mark. Maybe it's like a comma shape. Maybe it's that X stroke that we talked about. Make sure it's a mark there. And when we are doing skies, I really like to use the X's or little vertical strokes. And this is really small, so you have to use a medium-sized brush and small strokes for this. When we proceed on to our project, that's when you'll be using a little bit bigger brush and you'll be using a longer stroke. So you do want to make sure that, like on mine, there's tree tops that are overlapping into the sky. You want to get into those areas too, the in between, the negative space between the trees. Don't leave that blank. It is really important that you cover the whole paper, that you don't have any white of the paper showing through. So now I'm going to kind of go into that middle area. And so for this, it's partly in the background, but it's partly in the middle ground too. So those are those distant mountains that you're seeing there. You can kind of see it to the right of my image. You can see what I'm looking at. So this is a blue that's kind of a warmer blue. So I'm using ultra there. It's not leaning towards turquoise. It's leaning a little bit more towards red-violet or towards violet. Anyway, we're going to, I'm starting with the darkest areas within that mountain first. I tend to work from dark to light, so that's what I'm doing there. I'm looking for the darker value, and I'm applying it. And remember, those mountains are going to be highly influenced by the sky, because the idea is the human eye is looking across a vast expanse, and in between the eyeball and the mountains, there's a lot of sky and dust particles that you're looking through. So mountains tend to take on the color of the sky the farther back they are from the viewer. So even though you know that if you were to walk right up close to those mountains and hike up there, that mountain would probably be a different color. It'd probably be like brownish gray or green, depending on if there's some trees on there. We're going to ignore the actual true color of the mountain and go with the idea of atmospherics. And it's also going to be rather pale. So I'm mixing in some of the colors that you're seeing in the sky into the mountain. And if you go too dark, like mine's a little bit dark, I'm going to go back in and get it lighter a little bit later. And you're not just using one value on the mountains, like there's 3 at least right there, and I'm going to be adding more. So make sure that you're not just doing one flat value, because that's a sure way of making your picture seem very flat and not having depth or volume to it. So you also have to think of like kind of the topography of the mountain. Wherever there's an indentation, that usually falls under shadow. Wherever there's something that kind of pokes out, that falls in light. And you want to compare. So I'm comparing like the color of the sky next to the mountain to the color of the mountain itself. Just switch this to a monochrome so you can see what it looks like, my picture compared to the reference that I'm looking at in black and white, because that can help. So I'm going a little too dark on the sky and a little too dark on the mountain, but you can still see that there's some atmospherics happening, that the background is falling back. Once those trees get put in place, it'll help pop those trees forward. So I kind of outlined some of the trees in the distance back there. They're kind of this blue, green, plus a little bit of violet color to them. When you're doing trees, you kind of want to avoid doing those little dabs. Instead, you're doing strokes. When I do trees, I look at the darks first and I try and place the darks, and I picture them in terms of like shadow masses, like where the shadows are massed up. In this case, it looks like it's right around like dusk or like twilight time. So the tree is mostly in shadow except for the very tips of those like stand of trees to the right. So if they were in full sun, the shadow's on the right hand side. But I'm always looking at my reference for a comparison. And remember, certain colors tend to look really transparent the first time you lay them down. So the colors I'm using, which has a little bit of the phthalo in it, it's looking very transparent. That's okay. It's just the first layer. When I go to hit that up with more paint, it's going to make it look more solid and a little bit better. So for trees, it's really important that you mix a variety of greens. So I'm making my own greens here. I'm not using the greens that we have. I'm taking that kind of yellow-brown color and mixing it with a little bit of ultra, but I think also a little bit of phthalo. I also have some magenta that I can add to it, or some red to tone it down a little bit too. So now I'm kind of laying in that path. And remember, you want the warmer colors and the darker colors to be up front, so that I'm letting that be a little bit warm. But it still is kind of the wrong value. When I look at it, it needs to be lightened a little bit, so I'm going to be adjusting that later. The most important thing, though, is really to cover the whole surface and have no gaps.